Today in the EU, Moldova and Georgia, how domestic struggles threaten EU dreams. Moldova and Georgia are at a crossroads in their paths toward European integration. Just recently, Moldova had a constitutional referendum where voters expressed their desire to enshrine EU aspirations. The contest turned out to be tighter than expected, with allegations of Russian interference and vote buying. Further southeast on the continent, Georgian voters are preparing to cast their ballots in parliamentary elections this Saturday, October 26th, and the ruling party's close ties to Moscow and controversial policies raise questions about the country's EU candidacy. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Kiorri, and this is Today in the EU. To understand better the importance of the elections in Moldova and Georgia, and the challenges on their European ambitions, I spoke with Dr Tinatin Akhvlediani, Research Fellow in the EU Foreign Policy Unit at CEPS. Hi Tinatin. So we're here at CEPS offices to talk about Moldova and Georgia. On Sunday, Moldovans went to the polls to elect their president and determine their country's path towards EU accession in a constitutional referendum. We are recording this interview a few days after that. What are the current results saying?
On referendum, the first take is that you can see that it's actually runs lower to the expectations. What was actually on the Moldovans that we would see bigger win for the enshrining country's European aspirations into its constitution. And what it really shows is how much influence Russian interferences can have. This is already reflected in all the statements we've seen from the EU officials, as well as from the president of the country, but also into lots of media reports which directly report vote bribing, massive vote buying practices of Russia, and also the other people who are directly linked to the Kremlin sources.
Now, what we noticed when we were looking at the polls is that we were predicting a much higher pro-European yes, yet the margin was extremely thin when the results were being published online. How do EU officials view these results? Should they be worried about Moldova's future in the EU?
EU officials have been already quite well informed about Russian interferences, because if you read the conclusions of the European Council, EUCO conclusions, what we call it in Brussels, that was released before the referendum and presidential elections, you can already see there how much focus was put on the Russian interferences. This is not a news, right? And so at the end of the day, this is still the win. So I think what we saw in the statements, it's just very, very optimistic from the Brussels side, still congratulating to the Moldovan people so that they prevailed all the Russian interferences, because referendum is still the win. Also, what we saw is that I think very crucial was also that people who are immigrants, who are outside of the country, could actually vote in this referendum, because we saw how the vote was changing at the very, very last when they were still counting the votes from Canada and the United States. So we see how much diaspora can still affect the public opinion of the country.
And what was the referendum campaign like? What did the debate focus on?
First of all, it was not a referendum asking Moldovans whether they would like to join the European Union, right? This has to be not forgotten. It was about putting European aspiration into the constitution of the country. That was the question. And this was very blunt, direct from the pro-European government that Moldova currently has. But from the Russian interferences side, there were a lot of disinformation in the country that we can read a lot in the media, in the Watchdogs International Organization reports, that this information mainly basically said that if Moldova comes closer to the European Union, that will mean the slowing down on the morality, conservative values, LGBTIQ flag would fly on the buildings. Fake news, basically, on the people. And also the vote buying has had unprecedented scale. And we're talking about a country which is extremely poor, especially after the outbreak of the war. Moldova's inflation has been skyrocketing, and the country has already been poor before the outbreak of the war. They have had several massive energy blockages and blockades, and the population are very vulnerable to all the vote buying practices, and Russia has been using it to its interests. And also the country has Russian troops on its territory, so security problems, issues, concerns, which are of course a great interest of the people, have been manipulated very badly. The propaganda said, Russian-led propaganda said that, European integration is linked directly to war. Let's see what's happening in Ukraine. So security interests have been also badly manipulated, people were broadly disinformed.
And you're mentioning the disinformation and the Russian influence already, but then how much did it shape the campaign before the referendum and the presidential elections, of course?
As I said, Evi, this was mostly manipulating key narratives, which was look at Ukraine. So if coming to the closer to the European integration, that means war. And you're better off basically having peace if you don't, forward your path to the European Union. That's one thing. And another thing, big thing, is manipulating the family values, conservative values, and saying that European Union is immoral, that it's all about LGBTIQ, that it's going to have a huge propaganda on you. Then using Russian speaker population, where Russia obviously has the leverage, and a number of Russian language news media outlets that, of course, the government of Moldova tried to somehow have the control over it in the past years, but they are still there. These were the key narratives for the Moldovans.
Now, let's turn to a country that is closer to your heart, your country of origin, Georgia, which is set to elect its parliament tomorrow, Saturday. Why is this election so important?
Well, this election is very, very important for Georgia because Georgia currently has the Georgian Dream-led government, which holds majority, and they have held 3 terms in a row. So if they win again, this is going to be the 4th term. And it's also very clear what should we expect from them, because this is the government which has lately adopted very Kremlin-inspired legislation, which directly contradicts the conditions Georgia received on its candidate status for the EU membership. So if they stay in the power, we know that this will continue. We know that we will face state capture, we will face Georgia backsliding on democratic reforms, and country really coming closer to Moscow rather than to the European Union. However, if we have different results of the elections, that means Georgia has hope to return on to its European path and really deliver the reforms that are needed for its European integration. And on top of this, these elections are very unique because for the first time, we actually have fully proportional elections in Georgia, which is very important, just for our audience to explain why this is important, because this gives a real precedent that maybe Georgia will have finally multi-party government. Maybe we will see power sharing. So there will be 150 seats to be distributed amongst everybody who will pass the threshold, which is 5%. So the expectations is that the ruling party, this is expectations based on the current polls, the latest polls that suggest that ruling party should not get more than 30%, and the opposition parties, which are now united in the coalition, should get more than 50%, which will definitely mean that we don't have one-party government, and then we have multi-party government, and we may see the power sharing in the parliament.
And just like in Moldova, this election is happening under the backdrop of the Russian war in Ukraine. So what role does it play in the campaign?
It's a very good question, and there are so many parallels we can actually draw with what happened in Moldova just past weekend. The main difference is that in Moldova, country currently has very pro-European government. So Kremlin interferences have been more direct. While in Georgia, the current government is already doing what Kremlin and Moscow wants to see happening in the country. So these have been, the election manipulations basically have been happening by the voices of the current government, which is Georgian Dream. And the vote buying practices, threatening of the people, abusing administrative power that we already witnessed, and they're reflected in the reports of the watchdog organizations or the delegations that are going to observe the elections that already on the ground are observing. We can see this is happening again by the Georgian Dream. And also the same disinformation campaigns as we saw in Moldova. Again, the message is the same. It's about, in Georgia, again, as in Moldova, it's about not choosing between European Union and Russia, but it's about choosing between war and peace. That's the way Georgian Dream framed it, right? It's about, again, look at Ukraine. What happens there? It's a war. In Georgia, we have peace. But Georgian Dream, unlike Moldova, went one step ahead. They actually put up the billboards, which showed destroyed Ukrainian cities on the one hand, and they basically paralleled it with intact Georgian cities. This was very, very bad, and obviously it didn't have a good resonance across the society, but just doing this already tells a lot how bad the disinformation campaigns are and how they really try to manipulate the voters.
Right, and where are the EU accession talks with Georgia at? The country has recently passed a series of bills severely undermining its rule of law and therefore its prospect of membership. Can you talk us through these reforms?
Starting point is currently there are no accession talks between European Union and Georgia. We saw twice in a row in the conclusions of the European Council that Georgia's European integration is halted. It's basically de facto frozen. There is no high-level talks between the two parties, Georgia officials and the EU officials currently. And this is all linked due to the adoption of the legislation, which just directly comes in breach with all the conditions and with European values. And also the EU's bilateral support to Georgia, which has been earmarked for the country, has been frozen. So negative conditionality, as always see now. This is current state. What we can maybe look a little bit few months before was that Georgia was granted with the candidate status in December 2023. And that came with a list of conditions, 9 conditions, which basically is a good guideline for Georgia, what the country has to do, what the next government will have to do in order to bring country back on the European integration path.
And you've analyzed and followed Georgian politics for some years now, also from a personal interest, I would assume, as a citizen of the country.
Well, I'm a war child. I'm destined to just follow all the turbulences in Georgia and in the region.
Right, even more so then. So do these elections worry you on a personal level besides the international one? And why is that?
I mean, of course, because I'm a Georgian citizen, but I'm also working for the civil society sector, right? The recent legislation that has been unfortunately already passed, it threatens the civil society organizations, including the ones I'm affiliated with. I'm teaching in Georgia. I'm affiliated with several think tanks. And the work I do is, of course, very important. It's all about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freely, criticizing the policies if you need to criticize them. And of course, I'm one of those targets as well. I become one of those targets of the law. And more so are the organizations that I work and cooperate with in Georgia. And I feel very strongly about all what is going to happen. And I'm quite concerned, frankly, if this law, which we know in famous foreign agents law, is implemented. I mean, in case the government wins, in case the Georgian dream wins again, we should expect the law to be implemented. And if that is implemented, then obviously civil society organizations and the free media representatives will be the first targets of the law. And I don't even want to think and imagine what effects it will have on Georgian democracy. That will be on a very, very bad place.
Thank you very much, Tinatin. It was a pleasure having you on the podcast.
My pleasure being with you.
I am Evi Kiorri, and this was Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. You can get in touch with us by leaving a comment or review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, but also understand what topics you like listening to. This episode was produced by Miriam Sainz Tejada, Charles Cohen, and me. Thank you for tuning in, and we will be back on Monday morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.